wondered if you could talk a little bit more. I mean, because I don't quite know how to read the racial politics of some of the other images that you were looking at, and I don't know whether choosing to perform Othello plays into that in some way, and I was just curious about that.
I think definitely. I mean, I think there's a larger history in terms of the performance of Othello, in Egypt, in the Middle East, etc. The performance of Shakespeare in general. The actor, and the reason that I showed this photo was in blackface. So that's one of the interesting kind of because performances of Shakespeare in the context of the Caucasus. Particularly because the idea of the Orientalist image of the Caucasus was so tied to these other images that I tried to show of the mountaineer figure. So the figure of Othello's blackness is not as much the site of his image as an Orientalist figure for an Azeri audience, I would understand. Because the mountaineer, particularly the beard, is something that's really important in Russian history after Peter I. The shaving of the beard becomes a signifier of class as well as of race, and so or race as a category. And so I think the way that race is codified in the Caucasus is particularly different in some ways.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Other questions? Yeah.
I have a question for Sarah.
Yeah.
So obviously this is I think this is really a really cool project and sort of touches on issues that interest me in terms of language death and which is crucially connected to culture. But I'm wondering, it's kind of the flip side of what you're investigating, instances where literacy helps to really create something special. And I guess this might be a sort of like pop linguistics thing that I've heard. Maybe it's not actually true, but I've heard that, for example, Hangul, the Korean writing system, was so simple for people to learn that peasants were able to learn how to read just by looking, and that could be like a source of empowerment for oppressed communities, I guess. Is this something that you've considered in your work?
Yes, absolutely. So when I talk about the Cherokee syllabary, it's almost identical to what you've said. The Cherokee syllabary was learned by native speakers of Cherokee within 10 days to 2 weeks. And it was a phenomenon. It spread extremely quickly. What you find, though, is that if you're not a native speaker of Cherokee, it's almost impossible to learn Cherokee because the spoken language is so deeply tied to the syllabary. And the meanings that you would get out of the spoken language, the intonation, the particular ways that the syllables get put together, it's almost unintelligible to a non-native speaker. So whereas it would take someone who was raised speaking English 5 years, 10 years to learn how to read the Cherokee syllabary, the native speakers were picking it up very quickly. And Ellen Cushman just wrote a book actually about the syllabary. She says one of the great things that it does for Cherokee people who are in the midst of a number of removals, there's 3 or 4 separate stages, gives them a way to maintain tribal solidarity, communication, as bodies move to different regions of what is now the United States.
Cool.
Great question, thank you.
Matthew. So as you were talking, I was wondering about the concept of wetland, or the terminology of wetland in particular, as it became designated as a protected political category by the Environmental Protection Agency, and the kind of political and techno-scientific work that had to go into constituting that. And so I was wondering that in basically the process of definition and how that plays into the other issues around urban politics and so forth around New Orleans or other cities that are engaged in negotiating the relationship to wetness and wetlands in particular.
I'm glad you asked that, because I mean, one of the possibilities for this talk would have been the problem of the wetlands as a category, because it's not something that it's really a 20th century, like you said, through all kinds of different kinds of science and legal and all kinds of work. So I kind of got sidetracked in, thinking about how do we arrive at that, is that as a category? And so I'm interested in, thinking back, so I'm really working in the colonial and period in the 19th century, so, how to think about, like, what kinds of particular moments did wetlands landscapes, whether they were swamps or, whichever, linguistic tradition they're coming out of, like being named, and why were they being paid attention to at particular times in history. And so, one discourse that I work on in the 19th century which was in the literature, popular literature, was, the slave in the swamp, for example. So that would be one moment when people were paying attention to, wetlands landscapes. Another one earlier is in terms of the dispute of the New World, this ongoing, question about is the New World, suitable for civilization? Is it behind in its sort of evolution? Is it just two continents of swamps? And so this was part of, an Enlightenment, conversation that went on and on and on and on. So I haven't quite, kind of coming to because I don't really, I'm not sure how I'm going to, I haven't written that part yet because it's going to come last. How am I going to frame, in my introduction, or, how am I going to talk about the 20th century problem of the wetlands, right? Which it really, globally doesn't happen until, I think, like the 1970s, the Ramsar Convention, and exactly. So, yeah. So I hope that sort of answers your question. Okay.
I had another question to Sarah. Kind of two-part question, I guess. One is about what literacy is. So, not knowing anything about anything, but think of it as a kind of, understanding or facility, interpreting some kind of symbolic complex and shit like that. So, first part of the question is that right, because that might mess up. And then the second part of the question is more the real question is connected to where you were thinking of sort of the destructive potential of literacy. So I think you said something about how literacy is it's something like it's a technical tool which can be used kind of for good or ill. And the question of whether it's destructive or not is a question of what ends do you use it? Do you use literacy for? And I was curious about when the kind of title came up. I was thinking that sort of the fall and kind of can literacy, a kind of understanding of confidence with symbols or whatever, be kind of in itself a loss over something that's destructive, and maybe there's stuff about Gemini or maybe just. So that's the general.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you so much for asking it. So what I'm actually drawing from when I use the term literacy is a long-standing tradition in education and rhetoric and composition of literacy studies, which is challenging this fundamental dichotomy between literacy and orality, which is known in that field as the Great Divide, and all the ways in which the Great Divide keeps coming up. And it comes along with all sorts of ideas about civilization and savagery. And that's really where I look at it. So the idea that writing through time was teleological, and the reason that white Europeans can colonize the world is because they are far more advanced. And this is going to impact us even until today when you see neocolonial, neoliberal practices of missionaries or white educators going to the third world or the developing world and saying, you know what you need? You need literacy, the way that we define it, which is alphabetic literacy. So what I try to shift to is this concept of literacy practices, and that's really what's happened in the field in the past 15 to 20 years, to say that there is not one literacy, there's oral literacies, there's material literacies. A lot of people are talking about wampum as a symbolic system that is exchanged in the North American wilderness as a kind of literacy. So does that kind of get at your question?
Yeah, or the first part.
The first part, okay, and can you just briefly give me the second part of the question?
So going maybe with that second understanding of literacy, or the first can literacy be kind of destructive as such, rather than destructive as as a tool or as some.
You mean the
something
process of
that's-
entering into a symbolic system? Is that inherently destructive?
What gaining literacy, can that be a destructive thing? Being literate, is that destructive?
I would shy away from it, and I would say no. I don't want to get too Lacanian up here right now because it's not my comfort area. What I am really interested in is the political productions of ideas of literacy. So it's not as though literacy is some sort of thing that exists in the world before we put a bunch of ideas onto it. Literacy is something that develops highly contextualized, as everything that we study in our field. So I hope that helps.
Sharon, go ahead.
Kind of piggybacking on that, I wanted to ask about literacy and the question of scripts, because both with your example of the Cherokee syllabary and the representational system that was intentionally misconstrued as Viking, it seems like for obvious reasons there's this politics of literacy mediated by the script it comes in. And as a medievalist, we're familiar with languages that are written down in scripts that you wouldn't ordinarily associate with them, like in Judeo-Arabic or El Camino and things like this. So I'm wondering if there are cases of other North American indigenous peoples who might have been made literate through the Roman Latin alphabet, and what kinds of different experiences that would have carried with it in relationship, say, to the Cherokee.
So one of the first examples I can give of that would be John Eliot in New England in the 17th century, and what we think of now as the praying towns, who was very much invested in translating the Bible into Algonquian dialects, but that would have been done phonetically. So that is one example of where that happened. To return to the Cherokee example for a moment, a similar missionary practice was going on in the early 19th century, where missionaries were trying to translate Cherokee into the Roman alphabet, and it was simply not working. People were not becoming literate to the extent that they could read the Bible. And that's where Sequoia kind of comes onto the scene and introduces a system that was so incredibly useful that it's still, as I said, it's still being practiced and read and taught today.
Because Cherokee lends itself to a syllabary more than to an alphabet.
Exactly.
I actually wanted to ask a question of all three of you, because in a way I feel like I want to take advantage of the fact that this is actually one of the more thematically coherent panels that we've had today. I think it genuinely does work to think about this theme of space, for all three of you. So I wanted to just I guess I'm wondering about how each of your dissertations has influenced your thinking about space and spatiality, and how it's been, how theorizations of it have helped you, or how you have begun to theorize it, because it seems like you have different but sort of overlapping relationships to it. In a Native American studies project, space is about oppressive migrations of various kinds and displacements and movements. And then in Matthew's project, we had this really vivid image of space actually sort of appearing and disappearing, and a kind of ambiguity to the value of the space. And for Leah, you have the word threshold in your title, and Eurasia is this really. It does this really fascinating work of liminality, of sort of being between these two cultures. But in a way, there's a kind of liminal quality to the wetlands as well. Like just thinking about like Beasts of the Southern Wild and the way that represents New Orleans, that was something that was playing in my mind. So I would love to hear all of you just say something brief about the concept of space and what kind of role it plays in your work.
I definitely, I started thinking about my region in geopolitical terms, in terms of the relationship between Orientalism and Russia, and then the relationship between the Caucasus to other anti-colonial or post-colonial regions. And I feel like I always get into like a series of kind of like caught in the middle of a Venn diagram, where it's between us,
right.
and then it's less about what the intellectual milieu that was happening in the Caucasus. But I do think that there's a very interesting overlay of exchange going on, precisely because the Caucasus. I've decided to talk about the Russian Empire in terms of the Caucasus, because I think it's an example that's caught between the history of the Persian Empire as well as Ottoman influence, etc. And so it's very much always, the literary projects are very much always in dialogue with other traditions. So I think of space as it's the liminality of the milieu as a way of getting away from discussions of national literary traditions. So I'm trying to conceive of my project outside of Russian and Azerbaijani literature, even though Azerbaijan didn't really exist at that period. So
That's really interesting. Thanks.
Yeah. I guess I could answer that several ways, but I think because that one, I mean, the one image, the colonial image I put up of the French naval map, already then, 1723, you see this rationalization of that landscape. The city center, which was European grid, dropped down there, and then along the river you see these very regimented plantation lots. And I think that juxtaposition is really interesting to me. That sort of that a lot of people have written about in the New World context. Just kind of imposing this Enlightenment rational grid of space on the New World landscape. And with New Orleans and the choice of the site, I've read a lot of geography, working on this project. And one of the things that's really interesting for me is, again, to always be reminded that one of the reasons that site was chosen, yes, it is. It's a good spot. It doesn't tend to flood. This is just the actual old city. But the other reason is because there was already a Native American portage basically between the river and Lake Pontchartrain. And so there wasn't much work that had to be done to just sort of re-inscribe that, that for commercial purposes and so on. And so that's one of the main reasons why, that was the site that ended up being chosen. And so, you have this, I guess, this idea that, that sort of always being reminded that there's no such thing as the clean slate, that the European didn't just kind of impose an order on that space, that they were already, there was a mixing from the very beginning in terms of how the space was being used. So
it's been marked already.
Already marked, and so, really thinking closely about place and not just, sort of that cartographic, obsession with, regions and thinking about how, these big circuits and so on. So,
Right. Thank you. Yeah.
That's a great transition to my answer, because I want to retitle my dissertation "Marks on the Land," actually. And I have another chapter that looks at, I talk about Cooper a little bit. James Fenimore Cooper is obsessed in his Leatherstocking Tales with the supposedly unmarked graves of Native Americans, which in fact he knows are marked, because if you saw the Schoolcraft image up there, there were grave markers with Algonquian pictographs on them, which would have marked tribal identity, family identity, place of or position in the tribe. So James Fenimore Cooper has to do this incredible labor to erase every single indigenous mark that pre-existed his father, William Cooper's settlement of New York. So when I think about space, I always think about that concept of marking as part and parcel of the nation-building process, where Euro-Americans needed to build fences, they needed to generate graveyards, they needed to find ways to make the space marked in order to justify their presence there, and thereby erase other kinds of historical marks.
That's interesting. It's another dimension of erasure, which was such an evocative kind of motif last night too. Interesting. Sharon, did you have oh, sorry, right behind Sharon. Yeah.
My question is to Leah. First of all, I'd like to thank you for the presentation. It was quite honestly stunning in the way that you were able to discuss trends in literature coming out of the region, as well as Soviet nationalities, policies, and the role of the Comintern. And just the scope of it impressed me to the point that I just wanted to ask how this portion of your project fits in with the larger dissertation, and if you could say anything about that. With another related question of if what you're looking at in the in South Caucasus if you compared it all to Central Asia or any trends there, if there's anything meaningful that you explore in other thresholds or borders of the Russian Empire.
Thank you so much for the question and the very kind, generous comments. In terms of the scope of the project, the dissertation looks at, I begin really in 1830 or 1828 and go through 1929 as the last text I look at. But I think I'm going to shorten the period because it's too long. I think I was very interested in the way that a lot of the ideas, a lot of the images of the Caucasus reappear in the 20th century. At the Comintern, Pushkin and Lermontov, the 19th century canonical Russian writers, are evoked several times in the political tracks. And so I'm very interested in the way that those images of the revolutionary Caucasus recur. And in terms of the relationship to Central Asia, there are certainly a lot of parallels. The main difference in terms of a lot of the literary works that are produced, these journals such as Molla Nasreddin, which I showed here, are written in a kind of a Turkic, universalized Turkic that was developed in the beginning of the 20th century that could have been read throughout the Russian Empire as well as the Ottoman space. So these texts are being read throughout Central Asia, and the theater troupes are also performing throughout the Russian Empire, Kazan, the Volga region, as well as Central Asia. So definitely there's a lot of fluid movement of these ideas. I chose Baku because of its role as an industrial center, the huge oil boom in the 20th century, and its role in the early formation of the Soviet Union as an administrative center. But definitely, I think a lot of these ideas are moving throughout the empire. The main difference also is that most of the form of Islamic modernism that develops in Baku and Azerbaijan with the early Musavat party during the period of brief independence between 1918 and 1920 is Shia based, and throughout Central Asia you have more Sunni based Islamic movements that are. This movement is often called Jadidism, Jadid, the word meaning new, and so, but the form of Jadidism that developed is largely based on Sunni Islam. So there's I'm sorry,
Sharon had one final brief question, and we'll have to answer. Thank you. We can continue after. Sharon, did you want to ask a final question?
I wanted to ask if, with your cartographic and novelistic mapping of French New Orleans, what happens when the U.S. takes over? Is there a continuity in the discourses?
Yes and no. I think the way I'm looking at it is I look at it from, I read regional literature like George Washington Cable from the late 19th century, looking back at that transition. So it's tinged with all this sort of nostalgia and different kinds of racialisms and so on. So I don't have a ready answer for that because I haven't really been thinking focused on the actual sort of period of handover. But yeah.
Well, please join me in thanking our three wonderful